Hi, friends. I'm back after a long silence, but this time with a more interesting story and with a very happening topic. There is a lot of media attention. There is a lot of a focus from international community. It's all about Hong Kong protest. So, without further ado, let's get into this topic. What is the reason for Hong Kong protest? Democratic reform, fear of losing rights and freedoms, legislative process of 2019 Hong Kong extradition bill, accusation of police violence on 12 June 2019 protest, and subsequent events that related to the action of police. Now let's understand a bit about Hong Kong. Hong Kong includes 426 square miles of territory in the South China Sea, and it is today one of the most densely occupied and economically independent parts of the world. Let's roll back to the history to understand as how Britain handed over the territory to China, what happened during the handover, and things that have catapulted after that. Now, key takeaways. On June 19, 1898, the British under Queen Victoria brokered a 99-year lease agreement for the use of Hong Kong after China lost a series of wars fought over the British trade in tea and opium. In 1984, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and Chinese Premier Zhao Jiang negotiated the underlying plan for the lease to end, such that Hong Kong would remain a semi autonomous region for a 50-year period after the lease ended. The lease ended on July 1st, 1997, and since then, tensions between the democratically minded Hong Kong population and the People's Republic of China have continued, although Hong Kong remains functionally separate from the Chinese mainland. July 1st, 1997 is a very critical day because the lease ended on this specific day and government of Great Britain transferred control of British Hong Kong and the surrounding territories to the People's Republic of China. The transition have been more or less smooth, although human rights issues and Beijing's desire for greater political control cause considerable friction from time to time. Events since 2004, particularly in the summer of 2019, have shown that universal suffrage continues to be a rallying point for Hong Kongers, while the PRC is clearly reluctant to allow Hong Kong to achieve full political freedom. Now, as why this protest sparked and why things have turned more violent in 2019, it all goes back to the death of a young Hong Kong woman in Taiwan in February 2018 after her body was found stuffed in a suitcase left near a train station. Taipei detectives believed her boyfriend, Hong Konger Chang Tong Kai, aged 20, was the prime suspect, but he had already returned to Hong Kong and could not be sent to Taiwan to help with the investigations. Reason being, there was no extradition agreement between the two jurisdictions. Now, Hong Kong had to find ways or had to amend the bills or to make changes to their law in order to handle these cases. But then, why it has led to such violence? Now, in 2019, Hong Kong government came up with an extradition bill, which, if passed, would have led to Chan being sent to Taiwan. However, the bill drew widespread criticism because it also allowed extradition of fugitives to the other jurisdictions, including the mainland China. Now, critics said that It would lead to white collar suspects and others being sent to the mainland where they would have no guarantee of a fair trial given the opaque legal system. What started as largely peaceful street marches and demonstrations against the bill intensified over the second half of 2019, even after the government withdrew the detested piece of legislation. The protests were marked by increasing violence and vandalism of public property, businesses, and banks. Masked, black clad radicals stormed the legislature, disrupted operations at MTR stations, often trashing facilities, and brought Hong Kong International Airport to a standstill over several days in August before moving on to occupy the university campuses. June 9 last year marked the start of anti government protests that continued for months, becoming increasingly violent. That day, an estimated 1 million people took to the streets to demonstrate against an extradition bill which would have allowed fugitives to be sent to the mainland China and other jurisdictions with which Hong Kong has no exchange arrangement. There was a brief respite from the unrest after the opposition camp swept district council elections in November, taking control of 17 out of 18 councils. For a few months in 2020, there were no protests as the arrival of COVID-19 pandemic in January brought various measures to slow the spread of the new coronavirus, including social distancing rules and restrictions on gatherings. Protesters were back on the street in May, but were often quickly dispersed by more forceful police action. The protesters returned to the streets in early May. This time they opposed the national anthem bill, which outlawed misusing or insulting the March of the Volunteers with fines up to Hong Kong dollars 50,000 and 3 years in prison. The law, which critics said would erode the freedom of expression, was passed amid chaotic scenes in the Legislative Council on 4th of June 2020. Protesters also objected to Beijing's move to introduce a national security law specifically designed for Hong Kong to outlaw acts of subversion, succession, terrorism, or conspiring with foreign influences. Tired of waiting for Hong Kong to draft its own national security law as required under Article 23 of the Basic Law, the city's mini constitution, Beijing began drafting the law itself. It could be in place by as early as the end of June, and critics fear that it will mean significant curbs on the activities of protesters and opposition politicians. Now, how did the protests gain international attention? During the social unrest in 2019, protest leaders and pro democracy figures lobbied Western politicians, including in the United States, where they succeeded in gaining bipartisan support. Protesters in Hong Kong were also sometimes seen waving foreign flags, including the US and British flags. Last November, the US Congress passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, under which the administration must decide annually if Hong Kong still enjoyed sufficient autonomy from mainland China to qualify for the special trade treatment. In fact, the US and Britain reacted strongly when Beijing announced in May that it was preparing a national security law for Hong Kong. In the midst of a trade war and heightening tension between US and China, the US declared that Hong Kong was no longer highly autonomous from Beijing. US President Donald Trump then announced he intended to strip the city of its preferential trading status. Britain, meanwhile, said the national security law went against the Sino British Joint Declaration signed in 1984 before Hong Kong was returned to China in 1997. Under the agreement, China's basic policies regarding Hong Kong would remain unchanged for 50 years after the handover, including the promising city a high degree of autonomy. Britain has said it will now make it easier for the Hong Kongers holding British national passports to move there if they wish. Now, what lies ahead for the protest movement? Now, the protesters insist that they will keep their fights on till all the demands have been met. Now, unlike in the past, now even police has changed their tactics. They don't wait for the violence to erupt and then react, but rather they are preempting the protesters. It is left to be seen if the new national security law by Beijing will take effect and will have an influence on Hong Kong protesters, and how is it going to affect. Critics expect that the law may be used against the protest leaders and their supporters. Beijing has also indicated that when the law is in place, mainland agents may arrive in Hong Kong to help enforce it. Now, that's a interesting development, and we'll have clarity on this in subsequent months. It's a very complicated thing. There is a international influence on these developments, but let's see. As always, China is too big a power to ignore and to undermine. So let's see how it goes. That's it for this blog. I'll speak more about different topics in my subsequent blog. Till then, stay safe, stay healthy. See you. Bye bye.